Chapter 4. Hugo Drax at Home. Bond came down the corridor from the 747 at Los Angeles Airport, feeling a familiar sense of jet-lagged irritation that he had to relive half a day of his life. Still, at least nobody had pushed him out of the airplane this time, and the cold buffet in first class had been a welcome change from the usual overheated plastic food made particularly unbearable by the bestowal of fatuous titles in gastronomic French. There had even been a well-chilled bottle of Pouligny Montrachet rejoicing the eye with the 1971 printed on its damp label.
Will James Bond, passenger from London, please make himself known at the British Airways desk?
Bond heard the message as he came out into the open concourse and stepped aside from the mass of passengers streaming like lemmings to see if their baggage had accompanied them on the flight. A clean-cut young man wearing a short-sleeved shirt and a button bearing the legend, "I'm happy when you're happy," was waiting behind the British Airways desk with an upturned pencil poised for action. Behind the desk stood a girl of surpassing beauty who could only have been American. Her 2 rows of perfect teeth were not only white, but reflected enough light into the eyes of the beholder to dazzle. The large blue eyes were widely spaced and balanced the longish, straight nose and the warm, generous mouth. The blonde hair, which shone like spun silk, bounced as if animated by the aura of good health that radiated from every chromosome of her body. As Venus rose off Paphos on the island of Cyprus, so could this girl have appeared out of the sea off Malibu and stalked ashore to take her natural place as a Californian beach goddess. She was wearing a one-piece uniform that looked like a mechanic's overall and accentuated her copper tan. From a distance, Bond was not certain whether the uniform was worn for fashion or expediency. When she got nearer, he saw the word Drax emblazoned on one of the pockets, beside an insignia which appeared as a double spire within intersecting orbits. Bond's interest quickened. The girl looked at him expectantly. "Mr. Bond?" There was a faint but discernible edge of hope in her voice that was not unflattering. "That's right." "Hi, I'm Trudy Parker. Mr. Drax sent me to fetch you." Her manner was relaxed and friendly. There was none of the obsequious formality that Bond was used to receiving when being met at airports. "That's very thoughtful of him," said Bond. He prepared to follow the last of the departing passengers from his flight, but Trudy held out a slim hand.
"If you give me your baggage tags, I'll have your stuff sent on. We're not going that way."
The young man behind the counter twisted his pencil through his fingers and received the tags as if they were precious gifts. Bond decided that the name Drax clearly stood for something in this part of the world.
"Follow me."
Bond did as he was told and found it no hardship. Trudy moved beautifully, rising on the balls of her feet as if she was about to launch into a dance routine with each step. Her shoulders were broad and well-muscled, with one arm slightly more developed than the other. Bond surmised that she did a lot of swimming and probably played a club-standard game of tennis. She led the way into one of the satellite corridors that bore no letter or flight number, and they descended a ramp and emerged into bright sunshine. At a few hundred yards distance were the banks of commercial aircraft nuzzling by their satellite corridors like calf at a bulk feeder. Directly ahead, across the runway, was a helicopter of a gyrodyne design that Bond did not recognize. Proudly emblazoned along the side were the words Drax Airlines and the symbol that adorned Trudy's uniform. "Are you my guide and mentor?" asked Bond. "I'm your pilot." Bond made a good job of conquering his surprise. California was no place to be accused of sexism. "I don't recognize the helicopter."
"There's no reason why you should. It's a prototype of a model Mr. Drax is developing."
"I didn't know he owned an airline."
"He's big in communications,"
said Trudy casually.
"He owns a couple of railways in South America. Then there's the steamship company in Japan, and his trucking business. I don't really know the half of it. I should think only Mr. Drax and maybe some of his accountants do."
She nodded to another helicopter that was standing by with a Drax pilot in the cockpit.
"He'll be along with your bags in a few minutes."
I feel very well looked after, said Bond.
That's the idea.
She gestured towards the helicopter.
I guess you've flown in one of these before.
Quite a few times, said Bond.
Good. Then I don't need to give you the reassurance bit.
You mean we're just going to take off? Asked Bond. What about the passport formalities? I have just flown in from England.
When you're a guest of Mr. Drax, things become very informal.
Trudy smiled engagingly.
Mr. Drax wouldn't invite anybody if it wasn't in the best interest of the USA.
He seems a law unto himself, said Bond. Trudy climbed into the cockpit.
He's a very successful man. Americans respect success. Not only that, they trust it.
She waited until Bond was strapped in beside her and then spoke swiftly into the radio, asking for permission to take off. Seconds later, they were climbing steeply and spinning away towards the north. Bond looked about him for signs of the much-trumpeted Los Angeles smog and wondered if it was as difficult to run down as a genuine London pea super. Below him was an impression of long, straight streets running across each other like latticework, whilst broad freeways curved to the horizon. It was like the layout of a giant snakes and ladders board. How far have we got to go? Asked Bond.
A couple of hours. Is this your first time in California?
Bond admired the relaxed skill with which Trudy controlled the helicopter. As a man who liked nothing better than to be behind the wheel of a fast car, he had always responded to an attractive woman who knew how to handle a machine. I've been here a few times, said Bond. I know the East Coast better.
You look kind of Ivy League.
You don't make that sound like a compliment, said Bond.
I didn't mean to make it sound like an insult either.
Trudy pointed down through the perspex.
That's Hollywood.
So there is the big sign on the hill, said Bond. It's a shame nobody gives it a coat of paint.
I'm certain they'd be real grateful for any volunteers.
Trudy applied fingertip pressure to the controls and the helicopter shifted direction towards the northeast. Bond smiled to himself. He liked Trudy. She was self-assured and she had a sense of humour. There was no trace of pretension about her. She was also a damn good pilot. Not for the first time, he considered how beauty can almost be a disadvantage to a woman. Most men believe that women purchase beauty from the gods at the price of intelligence. When he had first seen Trudy, he had thought she must have been a cover girl much sought after by toothpaste advertisers. If she had been plain, round-shouldered and dressed in a calf-length smock, he would have been prepared to believe that she was a Nobel Prize winner. San Fernando on our left, indicated Trudy. Bond scolded himself. Trudy was absorbing too much of his attention. She was a beautiful girl, but she was not the reason he was in California. I expect you know why I'm here, he asked. Trudy shook her head.
Nope. We get a lot of visitors. I don't know everything that goes on. I'm just a humble pilot in the service of the Drax Corporation.
You know about the crash in Alaska, though? Trudy's face grew serious.
Yeah, I heard about that. The 747 coming down with the Moonraker. They were on their way to England, weren't they?
That's right. Bond was interested to hear the official version of the crash repeated back to him. The disappearance of the space shuttle had not been made common knowledge. I'm investigating the crash.
So you've been to Alaska?
That's right.
Gee, you must have moved fast.
Bond studied the girl out of the corner of his eye. There was nothing in her expression to confirm that she knew he had been lying about visiting Alaska. Los Angeles and its satellite towns had now been left behind, and the Gyrodyne was flying with impressive speed and smoothness over a flat, desert-like plain with a range of mountains in the distance. Bond calculated that they must have been on the outer fringes of the Mojave Desert. It was an inhospitable region bisected by long ravines and dried-up riverbeds. The ground was reddish-brown and peppered with scrub, and the hot desert wind was throwing up miniature dust storms that cast a fine film against the perspex canopy. Bond was surprised by the direction they were taking. He had anticipated that Drax's space venture would be situated near his main California installation, in the San Joaquin Valley north of Bakersfield.
We're over the Drax estate now,
said Trudy. She performed a creditable rendition of the old Western cliché.
As far as your eye can see, that's Drax country.
He owns a lot, doesn't he? Said Bond. Trudy turned her head, and there was no humour in her eyes.
What he doesn't own, he doesn't want.
Bond let silence reign and watched the sage brush drifting across the plain. Almost imperceptibly, the outline of the distant mountains slowly began to harden, and the desert give way to more fertile grazing ground, browsed over by long-horned cattle that hardly bothered to raise their heads as the helicopter flew over. Ahead, the grass was greener still, and there was a sprawling collection of buildings that looked like a small town.
This is the main complex,
said Trudy matter-of-factly. Bond looked down, impressed. There was a railway line and a small marshalling yard, what appeared to be a medium-sized power station, and 5 enormous hangars, one bearing the word Moonraker painted on its roof. Bond thought back to the Hollywood sign. This one was larger. A landing strip and a control tower lay adjacent to the hangars, and there was a large semicircular building that Bond guessed must have been a wind tunnel. "So this is where the Moonraker shuttle is made?" he asked.
That's right. Workshop, hangars, design, and experimental blocks, test center, the whole caboodle.
Trudy had taken the chopper down low, and Bond could see men in overalls operating forklift trucks in the deep valleys between the hangars. Apart from the sign on the roof, there was nothing to tell the visitor that this place was not a large factory tucked away in the desert, just as, perhaps, an ammunition factory might be. Bond looked ahead and was puzzled to see the line of tall poplar trees. Even more so when he caught a glimpse of what lay beyond them. A French Renaissance chateau, scarcely smaller than Chambord, its turrets gleaming in the sun like something out of a fairy story. Bond refused to believe what he was seeing. It must be a facade, some remnant from a long-forgotten film, shot in the desert that must have been left standing because of its amusement value. Look behind it and there would be an untidy framework of scaffolding to keep the thing upright. But the stones looked real enough, as did the formal French gardens with their box hedges, shingle paths, and orderly battalions of identical flowers. Bond turned to Trudy and saw the amused expression on her face.
Every stone bought from the Loire Valley.
By Hugo Drax?
Who else?
Bond looked again at the majestic sweep of the white stone and the recessed windows twinkling like rows of scales on a fish's back. Magnificent. Why didn't he buy the Eiffel Tower as well? Trudy smiled.
He did, but the French government refused him an export permit.
Bond grinned back at her. Well, I suppose if you have to live next to your work, you might as well do it in comfort. He returned his gaze to the gardens. They were almost over-generously endowed with marble statues of athletes and goddesses reaching from their plinths as if desperately trying to attract attention. Their very number suggested that they were genuine, and that Hugo Drax was a man who could never have enough of a good thing. The gyrodyne swept around the corner of the building, and Bond looked in vain for the scaffolding. A formal lawn fronted the long expanse of the building, and on it 50 young men and women lay on their backs in 5 rows of 10. As Bond focused on the scene, they sprang to their feet, raised their arms above their head, and began to rotate their upper bodies on the fulcrum of their hips. They were dressed in black leotards, and at first glance appeared like a ballet class undergoing a program of loosening up calisthenics. What was immediately obvious to Bond, as they stretched their arms upward and tilted back their heads, was that they were the most beautiful group of people he had ever seen. He looked at Trudy questioningly.
They're the astronaut trainees. They're part of the project very close to Mr. Drax's heart, the Drax Corporation Astronaut Training Scheme.
I thought all that was handled by the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, said Bond.
It used to be, but Mr. Drax offered a scholarship if it could be open to people from all over the world.
She shrugged.
You know, like space belongs to everybody. It was an offer NASA could hardly refuse. They provide a lot of the teaching staff. The Drax Corporation has paid for the installation.
Bond looked back, admiringly. They're more like the finalists in a Mr. and Miss Universe contest. Trudy smiled.
Mr. Drax went out of his way to select the finest physical specimens.
Bond looked at Trudy appreciatively. I gathered that back at the airport. Trudy's fingers tightened on the handle of the control column.
"You're trying to turn a young girl's head, Mr. Bond."
She moved her arm, and the helicopter dipped earthwards. When the rotor blades had almost stopped turning, and the banshee wail of the engine died away to the shudder of a sewing machine shuttle, the canopy was drawn back, and Bond unclipped his belt and climbed down to the small takeoff pad on which they had landed. "Thanks for the ride," he said. Trudy's smile suggested sunlight.
"Anytime,"
she said. She gestured towards a flight of stone steps, and Bond climbed out, feeling the warm desert air on his face. So incongruous were his surroundings that he found it difficult to know exactly where he was. It was as if he had suddenly arrived inside a dream that had taken on the trappings of reality. A man in the black jacket and striped grey trousers of an English manservant hurried forward as they came to the top of the steps.
"Mr. Bond's bags will be arriving in a few minutes, Gilbert,"
said Trudy.
"I'll show him his room."
"Yes, miss." The man was English. He spoke with a faint trace of a Cockney accent. He lowered his head to Bond by way of a respectful greeting, and remained at the top of the steps with his hands clasped across the front of his body, scanning the sky like a hunter's dog waiting for the first duck. Trudy led the way across the terrace past poker-shaped shrubs in wrought iron tubs and through French windows that reached up 3 times Bond's height and still fell 12 feet short of the sculpted ceiling of the interior. The drawing-room stretched away like a picture gallery and was a furniture repository of antiques gleaming under a turtle-shell thickness of polish. Bond glanced about him as he crossed the Persian rugs and tried to equate his surroundings with his recollection of Randolph Hearst's castle at San Simeon. He had never seen it in its heyday, but first impressions suggested that Hugo Drax had made progress in the realm of 24-carat gold eccentricity. 2 great doors allowed access to a marbled hallway with more busts in niches and alcoves and a wide staircase dividing into 2 beneath a large oil painting which must have been either a Rembrandt or a masterly imitation. Bond felt ill-equipped to judge, but his inclination was towards the former. There may have been something slightly vulgar about the display of so much wealth, but it was a very genuine vulgarity. Trudy moved gracefully up the stairs and turned right at the painting.
"We're along here,"
she said. Bond permitted himself a raised eyebrow.
"I mean, of course, that both our bedrooms happen to be in this wing. There's no shortage of them."
"What a shame." Bond looked at the suits of armour that lined the walls at intervals of 10 paces. They were mostly French, with the facepieces protruding forwards in cruel spikes. The corridor was wide, and the roof crisscrossed with painted timbers. The ceiling plaster between was an intricate tapestry of beautifully painted flowers. Even the leaded panes of the windows appeared genuine. An occasional yellow or blue diamond appeared among the thin, ice-like slivers of antique glass. Trudy stopped by a door and threw it open.
"This is your apartment. I'm next door."
"Very handy," said Bond. "I'll remember that if I need a glass of water."
"I'll make sure my tooth mug's clean."
Trudy glanced at her watch and became businesslike again.
"I'll let Mr. Drax know you've arrived. Your bag should be up right away. Will you be through cleaning up in half an hour?"
"I can be."
"Good. Cavendish, Mr. Drax's butler, will come and collect you. I'll see you later."
"I hope so," said Bond. He looked after Trudy as she walked away down the corridor and then entered the room. It was dominated by a large 4-poster bed with a silk canopy bearing a fleur-de-lis motif. Bond wondered how many kings and queens of France and their lovers had slept in it before he was accorded the privilege. The ceiling was high and painted with a scene representing heavenly activity that involved cupids with trumpets, old men with long beards, and plump pink ladies who were having a difficulty in disguising their private parts behind those insubstantial swirls of diaphanous material that they chose to wear in preference to clothing. There was a discreet tap on the door, and Gilbert entered to place Bond's battered Vuitton suitcases on a carved oak settle which stood at the end of the bed. Bond thanked him and walked into the bathroom, which might have been moved in its entirety from a Paris Hotel de Grand Classe. Tiles from floor to ceiling, a deep bath with taps like golden trumpets, and a Heath Robinson shower attachment constructed like an antique flamethrower. Black and white tiles on the floor, and more mirrors than in a whore's bedroom. A bidet with a light blue pictorial design that was practically willow patterned. A comfortable white toweling ankle-length robe hung sensibly next to the bath. Bond stripped off, took a long cold shower, and selected fresh underwear and a clean Sea Island shirt from one of his bags. Not only did he feel the desire to eradicate all traces of the journey from England, but he wanted also to perform a spiritual absolution, to feel again like a well-primed machine when he advanced to come under Drax's scrutiny. He knotted his tie, knowing that one part of his preparation was lacking. He wanted a drink. A glance around the room led him to a small Louis Quinze cabinet, standing on 4 squat bulldog legs. He pulled at one of the drawers and found what he was looking for. The whole facade of the piece had been skillfully transformed into a door which swung open to reveal a refrigerator, well stocked with all the spirits that an international traveller might have acquired a taste for. It was an act of artistic vandalism and might as well have just concealed a television set. Bond was glad that it did not. He could develop a migraine by merely glancing at the list of television channels in an American newspaper, or advertising catalogue, as he was wont to think of those publications. He bombarded the bottom of a tumbler with ice cubes and poured a generous measure of Virginia Gentleman over the glistening rocks. For his money, it was the best bourbon outside of Kentucky. The rich, brown liquid swirled enticingly, and the ice danced and chinked, as if engaged in some private celebration. Bond let a first generous mouthful of the liquor bite him in the back of the throat, and then drank more slowly. There were still 10 minutes before Drax's butler was due to appear. He looked around the room, and his eye was attracted by the headboard of the bed. It was splendidly carved, and the centrepiece showed 2 mermen in the act of besting a sea monster. The mouth of the monster was open, and its head stood forward in relief from the rest of the carving. As an incitement to violent passion, the piece perhaps had something to recommend it, though Bond thought it more likely that any occupants of the bed would be intimidated by the beast a couple of feet above their heads. There was something very lifelike about its bulging eyes and rapacious rows of teeth. Bond remembered his childhood, and how he had screwed up his courage to dart his fingers into the open mouth of a stuffed alligator. In a gesture that was pure nostalgia, he crossed to the bed and pushed his fingers into the opening between the 2 rows of wooden teeth. He was surprised to feel something move. Curiosity immediately aroused, he withdrew a thin metal pick from the lining of one of the Vuitton suitcases, and after a few minutes probing, succeeded in hooking out the object he had felt. It was a miniature microphone, fastened to a lead that appeared to stretch down behind the bed. Bond looked at the appliance thoughtfully, and then slipped it back into its hiding place. If it had been switched on, the sound of his probing would have been picked up, and whoever was listening would guess that the microphone had been discovered. He wondered if Hugo Drax liked listening to people talking in their sleep, or whether there were more voyeuristic reasons for the presence of the mic. Perhaps it was the accompaniment to some hidden camera positioned on the opposite wall. Whatever the explanation, it made Bond more eager than ever to be brought face to face with his host. Bond had been examining the contents of the room for several minutes without finding anything when there came a second discreet tap at the door. He opened it to find himself face to face with a grey-haired man whose expression was knowing without being presumptuous, differential without being humble, and dignified without being patrician. He wore black trousers, a black frock coat, and a dark grey waistcoat with horizontal stripes. His black bow tie was hand-knotted. He could only be Drax's butler.
"My name is Cavendish, sir. Mr. Drax is awaiting you in his study."
Bond nodded and followed the butler into the corridor. Cavendish led the way along the wide corridor and down a different but scarcely less imposing flight of steps to the one by which Bond had mounted. The sound of someone playing a Chopin waltz wafted up to meet them. Bond wondered who the pianist was. The technique was nearly flawless. Only in the matter of expression did the pianist leave something to be desired. There was an involuntary holding back, an inability to surrender completely to the liberated spirit of the music. Cavendish crossed a hallway, and the sound of the music grew louder. It was coming from the room they were approaching, and stopped dramatically an instant before Cavendish swung open the door.
Mr. Bond, sir.
Bond stepped forward as a bearded figure rose from a distant piano. His first impression was of the size of the room. The word study suggested somewhere small and snug. Perhaps it was a residue of his school days, but he had expected to find himself in a smallish room littered with open books and works in progress. A room that reflected something of a multimillionaire's myriad business activities. The only books in this room were the leather-bound volumes clinging to the ceiling in tiers. The room itself was the size of a small concert hall, but anything smaller would have been no match for the man who was now threading his way ponderously through the antique furniture. Hugo Drax was a large man with shoulders like an American footballer. He had a big, square head and carrot-red hair parted in the middle and flopping down awkwardly on each temple. His skin was pink and blotchy, and this was particularly noticeable around the area of his right temple and cheek, which had clearly undergone plastic surgery. The skin was puckered and shone unpleasantly like plastic that had started to melt. What could be seen of the right ear beneath the thatch of hair suggested that it had been badly mangled. The face had a lopsided look because one eye was larger than the other, and Bond guessed that this was due to the concentration of skin that had been borrowed to build up the upper and lower eyelids. Drax's mouth was almost invisible behind a large bushy moustache, and his side whiskers grew down to the level of his earlobes. There were irregular tufts of hair on his cheeks, and the whole appearance of his head was like that of an underwater object, which had accumulated accretions of weed and vegetation. By no standard could the work that had been done on Drax's face be deemed a success, and Bond decided that the plastic surgery must have been undertaken a long time ago, probably when Drax was a young man, and certainly before he could have afforded the finest treatment in the world. Perhaps the circumstances of his injury had precluded any treatment at all. Drax was probably in his late 50s. It was very feasible that he had been injured in the Second World War on the battlefront, where men were lucky to receive any medical attention, let alone have their faces rebuilt. Hugo Drax. Bond idly wondered which side he'd been fighting on.
James Bond.
The voice was a warm growl with the merest trace of an accent.
Forgive the immediate use of your Christian name, but your reputation precedes you to the point where I feel I know you already.
How do you do? Bond felt a huge blunt hand close about his. He thought of these hands playing the Chopin, and rejected once and for all the myth that artistic fingers are always long and sensitive.
I'm honoured that your government should have sent you on so delicate a mission.
The tone had a mocking edge to it that made Bond's hackles rise. Delicate?
To apologize in person for the loss of my space shuttle.
The word "my" was underlined. Drax turned aside peremptorily in a manner that was almost an affront, showing Bond his back as he picked up a pair of silver tongs and reached towards a silver tureen of the kind that Bond would have expected to hold deviled kidneys on a breakfast sideboard. Something stirred at the far end of the room, and two enormous Doberman pinchers followed the route that their master had taken from the concert grand. They paused before Bond and looked at him as if wondering what he tasted like. Drax opened the tureen and removed 2 gobbets of raw meat, which he tossed in front of the dogs. They looked down at them, and then up, expectantly, at Drax. He turned back to Bond, his face twisting into a shape of an ironic smile.
How would Oscar Wilde have put it? To lose one aircraft might be regarded as a misfortune. To lose two seems like carelessness.
He snapped his fingers, and the two dogs fell on the meat and were almost immediately licking the spot on the carpet where it had lain. Bond found the speed with which he was growing to dislike Hugo Drax almost alarming. There was a refined vulgarity about the gesture with the tongs which almost offended him as much as the mocking, condescending tone and the desire to impress with the Wildian quotation. Bond's voice was steely as he replied, "Any apology will be made to the American government, Mr. Drax, when we've discovered why there was no trace of the Moonraker in that wreckage." Drax spread his huge hands wide.
"Your loyalty commands respect, Mr. Bond."
The tone was overly sarcastic. Bond made his mind up that he must press on before he said something that he would later regret. "I imagine that you must have your own suspicions regarding the disappearance of the Moonraker."
"I think you only have to look 500 miles further west than the site of its disappearance. Russia, Mr. Bond."
The false joviality dropped from Drax's voice. A tiny pinpoint of red appeared in his distorted eyes to complement the scarlet flush on his cheek.
"Thanks to our pusillanimous government, we have surrendered space to them. Do you realize that I, a private individual, am responsible for nearly 40% of the American space program? It is scandalous, is it not?"
"It sounds a very patriotic gesture," observed Bond.
"It is not really patriotism," said Drax nobly. "I do not believe that one country should be in a position to occupy space, as in the old days a colonial nation might have acquired new territory. That is what the Americans are in danger of allowing to happen."
He smiled his ugly smile.
"With their experience of the British, you would think that they would know better."
Bond's expression gave no indication that he was offended by the jibe. If the American space program is lagging behind the Russians, why should they want to steal your Moonraker?
"Because the Russians take no chances. They know what I am doing here. They know I am the one dynamic force capable of galvanizing this country into an awareness of its responsibilities. They want to see what I'm up to. The Russians never sleep, Mr. Bond. Only when they are dead."
Bond saw the xenophobia in the eyes and heard the voice reveal traces of its Teutonic ancestry as it surrendered control to passion. He wondered if Drax had been one of the young Germans who fought on the Russian front and was left with more than physical scars from the experience. It might explain his obvious hatred of the Russians. The door clicked open, and suddenly there was a new presence in the room. A man, small in stature but built like a giant spinning top. He had no recognizable neck, and his swelling girth appeared to have put such a strain on his flesh as to have pulled the skin of his face tight and reduced the eyes to faint scar-like slits descending towards the lobes of his ears. His hair was dragged back from his face in a pigtail, and he waddled across the room carrying a large silver tray, on which were arranged a Georgian silver tea service, Rockingham china, and a plate of daintily cut sandwiches. The contents of the tray and its bearer made an incongruous combination. Bond looked at the man's tiny mouth and found it smaller than his eye slits. These glistened to show that somewhere behind the folds of skin, Bond was being subjected to close and perhaps unflattering scrutiny.
"On the table, Chang," said Drax,
indicating the positioning of the tray with a wave of his hand. He turned back to Bond.
"You have arrived at a propitious moment, one in which I pay homage to your country's sole, indisputable contribution to the advancement of Western civilization."
He extended an arm towards the Georgian teapot.
"Afternoon tea."
Bond smiled despite himself. It occurred to him that in the space of a short conversation, Drax had revealed a sufficient love-hate relationship with things British to mark him out as one of those who secretly resented his draw in the lottery of birth, a stroke of fortune that no amount of money could ever correct. Bond guessed that Hugo Drax would have liked to have been born an Englishman. He had not been, and therefore set out to ridicule that which he could not have. Unlike Groucho Marx, who did not want to be a member of a club that would have someone like him in it, Drax did want to be a member of a club that could never have him as a member. "I'm not a great tea drinker," said Bond. Drax's eyes mimed regret. "You disappoint me. Surely I can press you to a cucumber sandwich?" "No, thank you." Bond held up his hand as Chang proffered the plate and once again saw the glistening slits, sizing him up. The man's upper arms were the size of an ordinary man's thighs. He was like a compressed sumo wrestler. The destructive force that he would be capable of realizing must be terrifying. "The Moonraker, is it made entirely in California?" Drax swallowed a cucumber sandwich at a gulp before answering Bond's question. "Assembled, yes. Made? No. I own a number of subsidiaries throughout the world producing components." He slurped noisily at a cup of tea. "As I have intimated, the conquest of space represents an investment on behalf of the entire human race. It is therefore logical to seek out the best that each nation has to offer." Bond found his gaze drifting beyond the mullioned windows. The astronaut trainees could be glimpsed, still at their exercises. Perhaps it was a new batch. "Are you referring to people or skills, Mr. Drax?" Drax appeared to be surprised by the question. "Why, both, Mr. Bond." He pressed a button set into the corner of the writing area of an antique desk. "I have taken the liberty of arranging a tour of the installation for you. I think it advisable that you see how we go about things. We can discuss the matter of the Moonraker over dinner. I will expect to see you at the Orleans room at 7:30. As he finished speaking, the door opened, and Trudy came in. "Miss Parker will escort you to Dr. Goodhead, who will show you around. Please feel free to ask any questions that enter your head." The intimation was that the entry of questions into Bond's head might well be a haphazard process, with no guarantee that Dr. Goodhead would have a particularly taxing afternoon. "Thank you for being so cooperative," said Bond, numbing his already cold mouth with a glacial smile. "A pleasure." Drax took a step towards the door as if to show his guest the way, and then stood his ground until he was alone with Chang. He held out his empty cup and looked into the concentrating face as the tea was poured. "I want you to look after Mr. Bond, Chang," he said slowly. "See that some harm comes to him."